Again, welcome to welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESG-CV. My name is LaQuantia Goodman, and I am today's moderator. If you're just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hour session is being recorded for public record. Office hours recordings are on the HCD ESG webpage under Technical Assistance and Training. A copy of the slide deck and recording will also be emailed to you by your grant administrator or annual representative. Second slide, please, Taylor. Our question format. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered in the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Slide 3, please. Today's office hours session agenda includes the following: announcements, ESG, ESG-CV updates, office hours updates, ESG and ESG-CV questions and answers, and today's brown bag session on coordinated entry system, frequently asked questions. Slide 4. Thank you. Our new ESG and ESG-CV training calendar site. As a reminder, we have a training site and it has added a lot of new trainings within the past week. Please check the site for an updated list of future trainings using the link below. And now I'll hand it over to Connie for our ESG updates.
Good morning, everybody. So 2022 NOFN applications, we are going to release those by the end of May, 1st of June. So be on the lookout for those. And of course, we will keep you posted as we progress with getting everything ready for the next funding round. Those are 2021 ESG applications. We are just waiting for the internal routing process to have the final approval from the director's office, and then those that have been awarded, we will send you award letters, and we will also post those award lists to our ESG webpage. And I'm anticipating that will be the end of this month or the first part of April. And I've kept this slide up again. Those with 2020 contracts, please be sure that you're taking a look at your detailed expense reports when you submit your request for funds to us. Please start itemizing those out. We are really focusing on that and trying to turn things around this year. Please don't lump and just say staff charges or rental assistance, $10,000. We need them itemized out. For example, if you're submitting for wages, don't need the person's name, the employee's name, just put caseworker, our rapid rehousing program, pay period, and so forth. Just at least give us a title and don't try to lump several different types of activity or types of expenses on one line in the DIR. So it's going to take some more data entry on your part, but in the end, for monitoring and making sure that we are paying accurately, it will be beneficial. Next slide, please. I'm going to keep flashing this slide until we get to July. Please, those with 2020 ESG annual contracts, be very mindful that the expenditure deadline is July 7th, and that's not going to be extended. If you're struggling to spend, if you haven't spent, we should have your first request for funds already. And there are a few out there that have not submitted their first request for funds. You are out of compliance. They are due 120 days after your contract is executed. Please reach out to us, reach out to me if you want to schedule a Teams call, and we can talk about what's going on and see if there's anything we can do to help you. Please don't wait. Next slide, please. And again, this is our ESG annual team. Again, everybody's here ready to help in any way that they can. You can always reach us at the ESG NOFA at hcd.ca.gov inbox. We do monitor that several times throughout the day, and we will be sure and get back with you as soon as possible. That's all I have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie, for those updates. And now I have just a few ESG CV updates and reminders. Please continue to work towards submitting your February RFFs and budget amendments for cleaning up indirect costs in eCivis. If you have been instructed to submit a spending plan for March, please do so by the deadline, and the deadline provided by your grant administrator. Slide 9, please. Our upcoming office hours are detailed below. On March 23rd, we'll cover racial equity and data, HMIS and HDIS. March 30th, engagement with the DV providers, CES, CFC board. April 6th, equal access rule, the EAR tool, planning for LGBTQ plus inclusion. And April 13th, authentic engagement of persons with lived experience. Next slide. Here you see our COVID response resources. Please remember to use those as needed. Next, you will see our ESG resource links. Please remember that they are there and to use those as needed as well. Next slide. Any questions so far? No, we didn't have any in the chat just a moment ago. Okay, since we don't have any questions at this time, I will now hand it over to Chris Pitcher for today's brown bag presentation on coordinated entry frequently asked questions.
Thanks, LaQuantia. Next slide, Taylor. One more slide, thank you. Okay, well, the office hours portion of our presentation today is concluded. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat. We have the ESG annual team from HCD. We have the ESG CV team here with us as well. They're happy to answer your questions. We had a very lively discussion last week about coordinated entry. We were assessing the assessment, and I think that got a lot of feelings going. So we wanted to continue the conversation today. We're calling it frequently asked questions. Honestly, it's just going to be a space to talk about coordinated entry, the issues you're having, the challenges you're having, the successes you've found in your community. It's really good to share that. When I talk to folks, about California, they're like, well, what's coordinated entry look like? I say, well, it looks like 40 different things. We have, or 44 different things. We have 44 COCs, and it's slightly different in many communities. We might be using the same assessment tool, but our prioritization is different. Or maybe our referral process and how that works is different. It's not a universal thing. It is something that communities have mostly done a lot of tweaking to, have done a lot of changes based on the HUD guidance. So we thought it would be fun today to have very few slides. So I'm going to hand it next to our first presenter, Mindy Mitchell, to kind of walk through a slide that is a flow chart that she is going to have plenty of things to say about. But then honestly, after that, it is just a place for us to have a discussion on what is, challenges or successes in your coordinated entry, or just questions that you have around coordinated entry. It is still, even though we've had it for near a decade in some communities, it's still things that a process that have a lot of questions. So again, we have Mindy Mitchell today from Homebase. We also have Abby Miller. Abby, obviously, if you don't know who Abby is, former HUD snapper who did a lot of work at coordinated entry while there at the policy level. So a very good group of folks that can fill in the conversation when you have questions or comments. So I'm going to just pass it to you, Mindy, and I'll let you walk us through this amazing flowchart on the next slide.
Thank you for honoring the amazingness of my flow chart, Chris. As I told you guys last time, and as you've heard me talk about a million times if you've seen me on other contexts, I love flow charts. I love trying to help visualize the way things are supposed to go. Granted, they don't happen like this in reality, but for purposes of thinking about how we want things to go in our communities and thinking about how to problem solve, I just like visualizations like this. And as I told you guys last time, this is actually something that I came up with when working with Cynthia Najendra, who is now at the City of San Francisco, when we were both at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, to kind of expand the conversation about coordinated entry and racial equity, to move beyond just conversations about assessment tools and to think about it in this bigger context about what coordinated entry is. I always think it's important when we have these conversations about coordinated entry to get ourselves back to foundationally the reason why of coordinated entry. The way things used to be before were that individual programs were serving folks that they decided to serve. There were often really high barriers to entry. Those barriers themselves were inequitable, right? And the folks who got into programs were often the folks who, for various reasons, didn't have the most barriers to stability. And as someone who worked in a high barrier shelter, I totally know why that happened. It's harder to do our jobs when folks have more barriers, right? But those are exactly the folks that we should be prioritizing. Now, what we mean by the barriers and what we mean by prioritization, that's part of the conversation that we want to have when we're thinking about what coordinated entry looks like in our communities. So before I talk about the flow chart, I just want to, again, here's the resource from HUD, the core elements of coordinated entry. So we're thinking about access, right? How do folks get into the homelessness system to access those resources? We're thinking about, this is where folks get hung up a lot, assessment. How are we determining who gets prioritized for what things are we thinking about that should then enable us to say, these folks get this resource, these folks get this resource. We're thinking about prioritization, and that is where we have X number of housing interventions and we have Y number of people who need housing, and how are we going to decide who gets what housing? And then the referral process, right? So what we did in this flow chart, we wanted to start off this conversation with, like, it's really important. We're having a conversation about coordinated entry. You guys have questions about coordinated entry, but we want to start off thinking about it from an equity lens, right? And this starts from that very beginning, the access, right? Who has access to the homelessness system? How are people reaching out to the homelessness system, or how is the homelessness system reaching out to folks, right? So there's two different things going on there. So even from the very beginning, before the homelessness system even takes in, you're asking the question, how do folks get in touch with us? And are the means of getting in touch with us equitable? Do people in communities of color know how to get in touch with us? If we're doing outreach, if the homelessness system is going out to folks experiencing homelessness, where is outreach happening? Those are the questions that you ask at the very beginning, at the front load of the access to coordinated entry. Then the process that we more think about, which is where we kind of get hung up on, is the assessment, right? And assessment tools. But even in that process, hang on, I have two screens going because the Zoom one is a little tiny, so, and I'm middle-aged now, so I need to bump up my screen. So when you're thinking about your assessment process, you're asking questions like, our documentation, are we requiring documents to get folks assessed? Do people have to come into an office to be assessed? All of those questions have implications about equity and which communities are able to do those things. One of the common ones that come in is where documents are required. We have folks who are undocumented, right? And how does this make this whole system inequitable and inaccessible to them? Coming into the office requires transportation, right? So are we making, it's not that you shouldn't do things in office. For some folks, that's really great, but also make sure that you're building out ways to access and to be assessed that don't involve someone having to get transportation and come into the office. Now, the one that we get hung up on, this is an important thing, thinking about assessment tools. As I said last time, there are lots of different tools out there. HUD has never said you have to use a particular tool. A lot of communities did use the VI SPDAT for various reasons. We know that there are problems with that tool in some communities, but also there were some communities that used the VI SPDAT and actually showed that the scores were biased in favor of Black folks experiencing homelessness. There were other communities that didn't have a bias one way or another. There are other communities that clearly had a gross bias against Black folks experiencing homelessness. So those all say to me, the tool exists, but also who's administering the tool? We know, as I talked about before, and last week, there's lots of research on evaluative tools and how scores and assessments change depending on who's giving the assessment, the skill level of that person, the context in which the assessment is done. All of that stuff matters. And those are things that you should consider when you're thinking about the tools that you're using. If one of the ICF folks, if you can Google, I don't know if this is even public yet, but Chicago did some really great work thinking about different ways to do assessments and to decide who should be prioritized and what we're assessing for that gets at more equitable outcomes than relying on a score of something like a VI SPDAT that is very much focused on physical health and frailty and literal closeness to death, right? And there are lots of ways that you guys can do that. The important thing is to come together as a community and think through this whole process and be asking yourself these equity questions all along the way. If I make this decision, what's the implication for folks of color experiencing homelessness in my community? So you should be analyzing whatever tool you're using, who's actually getting assessed. Always look at your data and see if there is, let's see, hang on, Chris, I'm looking. No, this was, oh, maybe, yeah, it was Chicago. Yes, great, thank you. So that's a great one to look at when you have time. Another way of thinking about as a community, centering equity as you're designing coordinated entry and assessment. A really important thing to think about too, and one of the great things that Chicago did was we hear this constantly in every evaluation of coordinated entry and assessment tools is, why is this thing so damn long? Why are we asking so many deeply personal questions? There are ways to get at what we're trying to get at when we're assessing folks without getting so personal, especially on that first touch where I'm doing this assessment with you and you may not even have ever talked to me before. Thinking about when you're administering the tool, this has implications for progressive engagement too. Like, again, coordinated entry isn't happening on its own. It's part of this whole system approach. And are you assessing folks when they're first hitting like street outreach, when you know there's no resources available for them? They shouldn't have to go through this whole assessment process just to be put on a long waiting list for housing, right? And finally, thinking about what you're measuring with this tool. The SPDAT measures very specific physical health, physical frailty kinds of things. You can also measure things like barriers to stability. You can measure VI SPDAT, Esteban, a common assessment tool that people use.
Did you want to describe what that is, the vulnerability index? I don't even remember it all, what it all stands for anymore.
Service prioritization DAT.
Decision assistance tool. We got it between the three of us.
Yeah. It really is about deciding who is in a certain context most vulnerable and needs the most immediate intervention and case management, right? So it was supposed to be in that context. Yes, that's why nobody says it. Okay, next step, again, walking through this, thinking about your coordinated entry process from a racial equity lens. The next thing that's happening in your coordinated entry is you're prioritizing folks. So again, this is you designing your coordinated entry as a community. You're still asking yourself, you're looking at your data, who got assessed? Because if there's inequity in who's getting assessed, then that inequity will carry over into who's getting prioritized, right? So you want to make sure that you're assessing everyone without leaving other communities of color out specifically. Your community itself, your continuum of care has decided who to prioritize, right? So you have to ask yourself that question, who have we decided to prioritize? And are there equitable implications for that? Thinking about the role that the tool plays in prioritization, one misstep that a lot of communities had was that they were using the score to assign people to housing types. That is never what the VI SPDAT was intended to do. I would say that there's no tool to do that, to decide that people who have X score should get rapid rehousing, people who have X score should get permanent supportive housing, people who have X score should get just a housing voucher in the community, people who have X score should get problem solving, right? This is where progressive engagement comes in. That's for another conversation, but don't let that assessment tool score be the thing that tells you what kind of housing type. It should be much more robust than that for deciding who gets into what housing. Then you're looking in the matching phase and the referrals, right? Like who's getting matched to what housing type and how are folks getting referred into housing? There are additional questions that you need to be asking through an equity lens in that part as well. Always looking at your data. Who is getting matched to what kind of housing? Who's being denied referrals for getting into housing? Who's doing those navigation services? Are you making sure that the folks who are doing housing navigation and referrals are culturally competent and able to connect with communities of color and to connect them to housing that they want to be in? And again, looking at your whole structure of coordinated entry and what's the makeup of that, what's the impact of that, always looking at your data. And finally, on enrollment, always asking of your community and its data, who's actually getting into housing. And if you see a disparity there, dig down and ask why. Looking at how long it's taking different populations to get into housing, looking at the services that are included in the different housing types that people are getting, and then where geographically in your community are being housed. All of those things can implicate outcomes from housing. So in a lot of communities where folks did an analysis of kind of where disparities were happening, most places have disparities coming into homelessness, and those are a result of the structural inequities that exist in all the other systems, including in poverty. And in our housing system itself, in criminal justice system, all of those, right? And in some places, there weren't disparities within the homelessness system itself. There weren't disparities within who's getting in housing. Where there are consistent disparities in most communities is returns to homelessness, which tells you that you need to be asking questions on this last part of coordinated entry, especially thinking about services, making sure that people are receiving culturally competent services, making sure people are getting assigned to housing that supports them in the communities that they wanted to be in, and that they're connected to other services that are culturally competent for them after they're in housing. So even though we're talking about coordinated entry here, the conversations that you guys have as a community have equity implications all the way down the line to your system performance measures and returns to homelessness. So that's the flow chart. That's my main contribution to today's conversation about coordinated entry. Want to hear from you guys now. Lots of great comments from Abby in the chat. What questions do you have about coordinated entry? What experiences have you guys had in your communities, looking at your assessment tools, looking at equitable outcomes, equitable entry into homelessness, all of those kinds of things? Want to hear from you now and just be a resource for y'all for this conversation.
Thanks, Mindy. I love a good flow chart, and this is a good flow chart. Abby, you have been popping off in the chat. So why don't you go ahead and just kind of recap a little bit of that? Well, again, this portion of this office hour, the brown bag session, you can unmute yourself and talk, raise your hand, we'll call on you, put something in the chat, we'll discuss it. So this is your time. We have a good half hour to have a conversation. So Abby, why don't you go ahead and kind of recap a little bit of what's going on in the chat?
Oh, geez, I don't even know, Chris. I was just adding like little examples and factors to think about based on what Mindy was talking through, from access to move in. Really just that, well, let's see, I will recap a couple of them. Just confirming that HUD has always remained agnostic on tools, because I was that person at HUD. So definitely know that we've never forced a particular tool on anybody, or said, you know, this is the one you should use, for that matter. I think with access, the important point that Mindy was making, that I was just restating, is you have to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and say, yes, our marketing and outreach is getting to the people who are least likely to walk themselves through the metaphorical door of coordinated entry. And that is the responsibility of the system, to reach out and find and engage those folks. And that could be a demographic, that could be folks with a particular disability, like that covers the spectrum, folks with limited English proficiency, etc. And then I think the last thing I'll recap is this last point I put in here, that it is not just about who is enrolled in PSH and rapid rehousing. There is, in some places, a huge gap of time between enrollment and move-in. And there's also attrition during that time. So you have to look at, you know, it's not just who's getting enrolled. Are those actually then converting to housing move-ins? Are people experiencing discrimination at the step of the landlord or the property manager? And then once in housing, one thing I was just typing out, and I'll just say out loud instead, is, you know, if you are, for instance, giving limited time rapid rehousing assistance, and your model is premised on, you know, we give rapid rehousing, we make sure people are getting access to employment. Well, if people are being discriminated against by potential employers, and your model is based on people getting a job in a certain amount of time, having a paycheck coming in, then that discrimination is also going to impact on the system and the outcomes of folks who have already gotten housing, but then are likely to return. So just pointing out, you know, some of the hidden areas of discrimination that you have to pull up the curtain on and make sure you're controlling for.
Thank you, Abby. So our friends from Marin have put in a comment. So I'm just going to put that out there, and Abby, Mindy, you can decide who wants to address this. So one struggle that we have is balancing the highest need folks with actually getting someone housed. And I think that is a very common thing. For those who persistently refuse to engage or repeatedly fall out of our highest support housing, at what point do we take a break on trying to house them and give the resource to someone who will actually use it? And to me, this is the old highest need person versus creaming the system conversation that started coordinated entry years and years ago, that still plays out today with certain clients who just are not appropriate for the housing that we might have available for them. So I'd love reactions to that, because that has a lot of implications for many COCs across the state of California.
Chris, thank you for framing it that way. You know, I always want to challenge us to not fall in any way back into the people aren't ready for housing kind of mindset. Everyone is ready for housing. They may not be interested in the housing we have available. And the housing that we have available is the reality right now, right? So like there is a right now pragmatic reality about this is what we have available. None of this seems to be appealing to this person. First of all, like what can we do to make it more appealing? right? Like let's never lose that, like make sure that the onus is on us to figure out how to make things engaging for folks who seem to be not willing to engage. But then also having a space for having like the pragmatic approach of like, we do have X number of housing units available, and we have this many folks who need housing, and we don't want to leave anybody outside if we don't have to. So that doesn't answer the question, but I just, whenever these kinds of questions come up, I think it's most helpful for us as communities to take a step and just kind of go back to that original thing and say, like, this is not what we're talking about, is saying that some folks aren't ready for housing. Like, let's affirm that, right? Let's affirm that, and then problem solve what to do right now about this situation. And if we can always kind of, I think if we can reaffirm those basic, like, commitments, then we can figure something out that doesn't leave the folks who most need assistance behind, which was, again, like Chris said, the impetus for coordinated entry in the beginning was there were so many folks who were deemed as too high barrier, not willing to engage, not ready for housing. Those were exactly the folks who were literally dying on the streets, right? And being on the streets for decades. And again, those were disparately people of color, especially Black men, right? So getting back to that, honoring that, but then also saying, okay, where's the balance in this? And I think this is where something like, in some, Chris, you want to talk dynamic prioritization, right? Like, so we have X number of houses available, interventions available, match as many people as possible to what's available. This is where a conversation about progressive engagement comes in too. What's the minimal, like, intervention that we can match folks with that will get them out of homelessness and at least achieve short to medium term stability in a place until we can get them on to something more intensive, if it turns out that they actually need something more intensive.
So Mindy, Carrie
yeah,
put more information in about the folks that
Mhm.
that they're working with. That's really helpful, Carrie.
Yeah.
These are the folks I was thinking about when you typed that. It is there's a segment of folks who have been homeless for a very long time that are that need a very high level of services and care, really high touch. And a lot of systems haven't been built up in that way. So like what Mindy was saying, what's available to you all is often like private stock. You're not managing it. I think, Carrie, that type of question cannot be resolved through coordinated entry policies and procedures alone. It has to be resolved by looking at the system, using the coordinated entry information that you have about the people who you cannot serve in housing that is managed by private property managers or landlords, and figure out, what do we need in this area to serve this particular population, because what we have is not working. I think the dance of coordinated entry and system design is so interwoven that I really can't talk about one without the other one coming up. But I think in a lot of places, because so much effort has gone into coordinated entry, like standing it up, getting the policies and procedures, it's like, okay, but why isn't this process solving the problem? It's because it always has to be then informing what your system looks like. So how much you have of everything, who's managing it. So if you have, for instance, a strong service provider in the area who might be able to do site-based permanent housing, where you can have 24/7 staff, You can have some of the things that it looks like you need for these folks, that you start to make that investment. And I think that certainly willing to talk about dynamic prioritization, but I think that this is really an issue of system design and size and what you have available. The essence of dynamic prioritization is basically that you don't think about the most vulnerable or the person with the highest needs like as a number one, and until we house this person we can't go to number two, but instead think about like, and this is going back to like coordinated entry was never meant to be this rigid assembly line of like you're a 1, you're a 16, you're a 17, but more so overall who appears to be the most vulnerable or have the most severe needs or have the biggest housing barriers. And I always use all three of those together because different populations have a different reason why they've been homeless a long time, or different people do at least. So it's always housing barriers, service needs, vulnerabilities, that you look at. For instance, if you have 10 slots open up a month, then you're looking at 10 people a month. And you're not just focused on one person, you're focused on all 10. That's the basic idea of dynamic prioritization. There's a lot more I could go into, but yeah.
I did add some slides from a HUD presentation, Abby, you probably did years ago on dynamic prioritization in the slide, in the chat, so folks can dig deeper into that. I would like to go to another question unless Mindy, you had something to add. Yep, you did, okay.
Yeah, Carrie, I want to honor the difficulty of this. And also, like, let's bring this back to, like, Robert talked about bringing up the issue of discrimination, which is essentially disability discrimination, right? And where we kind of, this whole modern homelessness thing has its roots in deinstitutionalization in the 70s, right? And on the call I was on yesterday with some of the folks that were part of redesigning the coordinated entry system in Chicago, was acknowledging like we did this great thing, deinstitutionalization, but we didn't build out what the folks who were being deinstitutionalized were going to need for housing in the community. So we are all still dealing with that reality that there are some folks who need a higher level of care than even what's traditionally thought of in PSH. That implicates more than just the homelessness system. And so like in my ideal coordinated entry, what's happening somewhere, I'm doing my little mouse somewhere in between outreach and process, or access and process, and this is part of the diversion conversation too, right, which we didn't even touch on, is that we have the homelessness system, we have things that are funded by the homelessness system, but we all know housing is healthcare, mental health is so heavily implicated, mental health, behavioral health, all of those things, the criminal justice system. We want to have in a high functioning community, all of those other pieces of the puzzle at the table to say, this person actually has such a high level of disability, vulnerability, barriers to stability, whatever those things are, that these other systems need to come in and carry the weight, right? So that this homelessness system, this crisis response system can be really nimble and respond to the folks that it's best designed to serve. Again, that is not helpful for navigating the very real realities, Carrie, talking about someone who is threatening staff and other clients, right? Like of what to do about those folks. And coordinated entry, like Abby said, may not solve that particular problem. That's something that requires a larger community conversation.
Mindy,
go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, Abby, I'm just going to ask you to repeat the three things that you mentioned for Esteban and the rest of the group, because you did rattle them off pretty quickly.
Yep. That when you think about the factors for prioritization, that you don't only think about vulnerability. So that's why there's a vulnerability index. It only measures vulnerability. There are housing barrier indexes They only measure housing barriers. And then the SPDAT is about service need. It only measures service need. In reality, if you only measure one of any of the three of those, you will skew who's going to the top of that to quite likely a particular demographic. It ends up skewing by race and gender. But if you look across all of them, then you have a leveling of like, we recognize all three of these things keep people out of housing.
Thanks, Abby. And you got to hear some very famous New York City sirens in the background for Abby. So I'll give us some time for that noise to pass. We do have another question from our friends in Northern California CSC, or NorCal, also known as Shasta. So from Keith, we have, are there any tools or guidance on how to correctly, and that's a very loaded word, prioritize households to specific housing interventions? Our CSC currently uses the VI SPDAT to score, to help determine referrals, and it sounds like we need to adjust that process. I think, yes, you need to adjust that process. And what we were kind of getting at with dynamic prioritization, and what Abby just said with those three tenets, is a number is never a good way to, assigning numbers to people doesn't work in and of itself. It is a start, and it needs to be the start and not the end. And many times we've left it as that's the end. A 7 gets this, a 5 gets this, a 12 gets this. That was never really something we intended in coordinated entry. Mindy, I see you ready to rock and roll on this. So
yeah, this is the thing that drives me absolutely crazy. And again, nobody did a bad thing here. It happened that acknowledging the reality of providing services and people in crisis, and we want to know something that tells us this person gets this thing, like it's hard to do this, right? And so this was a way to kind of say, like, okay, now we can very quickly, these people get this, these people get that, but it doesn't work that way at the individual level. So this is where progressive engagement comes in. First of all, the VI SPDAT particularly was never meant to be, even though some folks might have said it was, it's not at an individual level. You can't say somebody who scores a 7 needs rapid rehousing, somebody who scores a 23 needs permanent supportive housing, especially at the individual level. For individuals, there's no way to know, there's no way to predict at the individual level, this person is going to need a housing voucher plus 24/7 services for potentially the rest of her life, right? So this is where progressive engagement comes in, where you're trying what's the minimal intervention that I can do to get you stably housed and keep you stably housed. And if it turns out after we try that intervention that you still need more assistance, then we have the more intensive intervention waiting, right? So if someone can put in, just find something about progressive engagement, like that's part of that conversation. So I would say absolutely do not use scores to assign people to housing models. I just, as on an individual level, it just doesn't work. I don't think HUD, Pamela, just Abby, you can, HUD doesn't require a by name list. That is a community solutions thing.
Yeah. Mindy. So I love talking HUD stuff. I'm going to step on Abby because this is kind of one of my things. When we were first doing coordinated entry, and this is, I want to be very clear, this is not a knock on Abby Miller, the amazing human person that she is, but many of us were trying to figure out coordinated entry well before the coordinated entry notice came out. And in that vacuum, 2 things happened. One is the VI SPDAT became almost a universal tool when it was never intended to be. 2, a lot of folks took on common terms from other places and said, oh, HUD must want us to do this. That is not the case. We've never, if you look through the CES requirements, by name list is not even in there. The idea of lists at all isn't in there, but it is a tool that is useful and folks have found a way to make it valuable within their community. So if you really want to know what HUD requires of coordinated entry, which isn't, to me and Abby at least, a whole lot, you can go back to the CES notice. You can go back to our CES tools. I believe there's a great CES checklist that I'll try to find while Abby's answering this question that lays everything out very, very straightforward. And it's not the elements you think it's going to be. Right, Abby?
That is 100%. So I think that what I remember saying ad nauseum when I was in the SNAPS office was that you can be fully compliant with the coordinated entry notice and still have a horrible system that is ineffective, inefficient. That what that notice is intended to do was obviously like hit all the things that need to be touched on, like the intersection of COC and ESG and victim service providers, and like, how do we make all of this work together? But when it comes to the part of assessment and lists and prioritization, you don't find a ton there. And that is because, assuming that every COC in the country has some particularities to it, that you don't want to be taking anything that is developed at the national level, slapping it onto your own system, and then thinking that it's going to absolutely work without tweaking. And so there's just a level of community process that has to happen with coordinated entry that can't be shortcut with picking up somebody else's tool or or using somebody else's prioritization scheme, because it just may not work for you and probably won't work for you.
Thanks, Abby. I think Esteban just made a really good point in the chat that I'm going to try to frame. And this, Abby, this was a session that you and I did with, I think, Community Solutions several years ago here in Denver. I remember having this conversation a little bit. And can we just look at like a VI SPDAT score, or a score, a number, as a quick reference, as opposed to being like the result of their housing? And the answer is, yeah, you should be doing that. I remember in that particular session, we were sitting with, I think, the folks from Calgary or someone from Canada who said, you know, we have a similar system, but, you know, we assess folks, it gives us a number, and that's the starting point. That's an idea. And then I think they had, and I might be making this up, like an I know better button, like, here's the more information I need to give you to really round out this person's life experience so that we can find appropriate housing for them. I always, that for some reason is always stuck in my head as, we need more than that number to really be able to house this person quickly, properly, and most appropriately was the word I was looking for. So just wondered if Mindy or Abby, you want to expand upon that at all? That's kind of my experience with it, but I'm sure you have yours own.
I agree with what you said, Chris. Where I would like to talk about something a little different, but it's not contradictory to what you were saying at all. I think that since coordinated entry has been implemented across the country, we've also seen a corresponding rise in the use of diversion, problem solving, whatever you want to call it. I've sat in too many meetings trying to decide the name of this thing, and I think call it whatever you want. But what it means is that you find and engage folks either before or at the point that they're entering the system or right after they've entered the system, and you try to identify with them how you can get them back into safe housing, whether it is the place that they came from and it's mediating with one of the other household members, if it is not going back to the place that they came from, but finding somebody else in their support network that can help, being super creative. I think that as we've seen all of these iterations of coordinated entry and like what it's illuminating and what we're trying to do in response to the issues that we see coming up, I think that diversion is one of the best that we've seen, because the reality of experiencing homelessness is, if you see me on Tuesday, the first day that I'm, let's say, on the street, I'm in a radically different situation than I was the day before, and then I will be a week from now. Just with my own framework, my own like ability to tell you what's going on. And I think this idea of asking a lot of questions, assigning a score, and moving on is not going to work. But really, what has to happen at that first step is just like, if you have to think about it in assessment terms, you are assessing for the likelihood of diversion at the earliest point. And you are going to attempt to help that person either get diverted before they have to enter a shelter. If they enter a shelter, you're going to try to rapidly exit them from the shelter. It's all the same work though. And that really is like the first chunk of assessment that should be happening, where you are working with that person to see, are there any strengths, any supports that we can rely on here? At that point, after that, if nothing is working, that's information. That tells you, okay, this is not going to be a super quick fix without any additional money, anything like that. And then you can, take it from there. Like, what's the next level of assessment? So I think if you can possibly just wipe the concept of a single tool and a single score from your mind and think about it instead as phases of assessment, what you're doing at each point is helping the folks who have the fewest barriers, fewest service needs, maybe none, maybe no service needs, and you're getting them back into safe housing. And then you have a smaller group of people to work with, and you're using a smaller intervention. And then you have a smaller group to work with, and you're using a higher order intervention. But that's the kind of processing that you want to be doing. Now, sometimes you're going to have folks that clearly, like, this person is ready for PSH, and it may make sense to have, do a presumptive observation-based, is this person a likely candidate for PSH or not? But it doesn't mean that you have to ask everybody 35 questions the first time you meet them, and then that score becomes some sort of fact of life that you then operate from. That was very long-winded, sorry.
Debbie. Mindy, what do you have for that topic? Anything?
No, that was
Okay.
everything I would have said, of course.
I didn't think so either. I'm just kind of scrolling through the chat and just seeing some themes. I did see something from Luis that I wanted to talk through, which is kind of having appropriate staffing, but specifically I was going to pull out that Luis works for a victim service provider, and that our victim service providers and our domestic violence providers as a group have the option and ability to create a coordinated entry system that works for domestic violence victims. However, what we've seen, or at least what I have seen and how this operates, is oftentimes that means the folks in the domestic violence coordinated entry system aren't getting access to mainstream housing through the other system, and vice versa. So it's not just being able to cover, which is one of the things that Luis mentioned, but it's also the trickiness of our victim service providers having their own coordinated system versus not is hard, because we have victims of domestic violence that are not in VSPs, and we have folks in VSP that actually need regular just mainstream housing through our providers. So it's something that I know I've struggled with. It looks like Luis wants to also add to that, so I'm going to let her go before Abby and Mindy take over. So Luis, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and talk to us.
So this is how we've approached it within our COC. We do operate the parallel coordinated entry, but within our COC, we adjusted the vulnerability assessment to give each agency 3 discretionary points so that we could help address people's individual needs. Within my world, there's more people that need shelter for DV incidents, which is horrible, than we have housing. So ours is based on lethality risk. Because if I have only 1 shelter room and I have 4 households fleeing domestic violence, we have to look at, okay, who is in the most danger today? Because the purpose of our housing is not just to alleviate homelessness, but to keep people from getting killed. So we will try and offer other shelter options, and I like your approach about saying, can we divert people? And we do regularly. If someone is in a situation where they need to get out, but they can stay with a friend for a few days while they make other arrangements, we can do that. We can do hotel placement if that's a safe option for a brief emergency shelter. So there's a lot of options around it, but where we struggle is we do follow the most vulnerability. And what we're encountering now is people whose mental health issues or substance abuse issues are a bigger challenge to them than their victimization. And unfortunately, we do not have LCSWs, and we do not have a psych nurse or anything like that. We're here for people who are fleeing, who need a safe place to stay while they rebuild, and we help them, achieve those goals. But we're having some trouble with people that their issues, they really need either permanent supportive housing or a very high level of care, to the point that they are not appropriate for our agency, because we're just doing more harm. I mean, like, if we have people that are self-calling the mental health crisis line and getting 5150 out of the shelter, that's a signal that these people are really beyond our level of care, and what our best option would be is wraparound. But if they're a victim, they mostly come, mostly it's like, okay, that's special population, they go straight to us. So I'd like to hear if anybody has any other ideas or advice for how do we work with that, when it's really more appropriate for us to be the wraparound side and the walk-in care, while they get care for these other significant issues that are really creating more trouble than the victimization, and that are really preventing them.
Thanks, Luis. I'll try to get a quick answer from Mindy and Abby if they have one, but I will note that we have an upcoming session on domestic violence and coordinated entry that we're going to dig in a little deeper. So if we can get a quick answer, maybe. It looks like Mindy's ready to go. So we're almost ready to wrap up.
Put the cat down. I think that for me, this just gets us back to the larger community conversation about, are we building something that is able to serve the needs that folks have? And it's okay to say the homelessness system is not where those folks are going to get those needs met, right? Louise, this is not satisfying for your immediate thing, but this is like, there's wonderful things that COCs do. And I truly believe it's one of the best ways to spend federal money. It's a collective impact model, right? But it's to solve especially these difficult problems that you all are raising, there's got to be more than just the COC folks involved. That's not helpful, but again, Abby, thoughts? I'm glad we're having a whole separate session on this, because you can just spend many hours talking about this and trying to problem solve this.
Yeah, I do not. I have nothing that's going to be satisfying to this particular situation. It's really tough. And I will be honest, full disclosure, I was typing a response to Pamela's question because I knew that we were going to run out of time. So sorry.
Thanks, Abby. And for Pamela and for Ada, who asked questions in the chat, who we will not get to, we will follow up in writing. So please enter your email addresses in the chat so I can pull them up later. That concludes our brown bag session today on coordinated entry. I bet we could have another 10 of these. So we might actually look in the future to have a few more of these, just to keep the conversation going, because it is such a complex conversation. So thank you for joining both the office hours and the brown bag session today. We'll be back at it next week. See you then.